Really nice to be with you. I have the real privilege of working with a lot of young people who are training for ministry. And this last week I've had the privilege of just being in a classroom as they presented. And it gives me a huge amount of confidence for the future. A number of them have been presenting on comparative religions at the moment. You know, that's the place of the course that they're up to. And it's been really exciting to watch as they research and come back and look at, in a sympathetic way, what other people believe and then how to connect with those people. It's really neat. Well, I haven't been to South Australia for a while, so it's very nice to be back here. I used to come over here quite a bit when I was in youth ministry, and I was saying to Nigel as I walked in here tonight, I have really neat memories of this place. This used to be the site for youth meetings during the camp meeting, and a lot of good things happening here. And some of these people probably were about that size the last time I was here. I stood in this church, I think, back in about 1997 was the last time I was here. So that's some time ago. Some of you may not have even been thought of. So it's good to be here. Let me tell you why I have a fondness for South Australia. And I was about 18 when I decided that I would completely sever connection with home. Said to my parents, that's it, I've had it. I'm out of here. And with two friends, just put my thumb out and began to go wherever that would take us. I had no idea where we'd end up. I just wanted to get away. Wanted to be out of church, out of home, out of school. Just had no desire to be any longer connected to any of those things. And so we just stood out on the road and just put our thumbs out. And that was fairly neat. It got us over the mountains. And we got dumped in a little town. Well, it's not even a town, it's a crossroad, halfway between Hay and Narrandera. Some of you have probably driven on that road. It's dead flat, there's nothing there. I started to have misgivings about my plan to leave when we got dumped at that crossroad. There's no shade, there is nothing there except a white pole. And when you've got three 18-year-olds trying to shelter in the shadow of a white pole, we started losing, the joy of it went out of it. Well, we stood there for quite a few hours, and eventually this lady and her daughter stopped. Can you believe that? All these men drove past us, but a woman and her daughter stopped. Thank God for women. So we ended up getting a ride, and she dropped us, I think she dropped us on the outskirts of Adelaide. We slept rough, we slept in the parks. This is a neat city. You've got a whole string of parks all around the centre of the city, so lots of places where you can sleep if you're homeless. Well, after a couple of nights, after eating out of garbage bins and all the rest of those, living rough, one of the guys with me said, I know a pastor in this city. And I said, what? What is the matter with you? I thought we'd left all that behind. He said, well, you're hungry, aren't you? And I said, yeah. And you want to sleep under cover tonight, don't you? And I said, yeah. And he said, that's the only alternative. So we went to this guy's place and he wasn't home, so we broke in. Now, I have to tell you, when I get to heaven, I'm going to seek that man out. And you'll know why in a minute. After we ate everything in his fridge, emptied his cupboards, ran his hot water dry, he must have been a good guy. I don't even know who he was. But he must have been a guy who liked young people, because none of the neighbours called the police. And we were there for days, coming in, going, like we owned the place. Now, it's one thing to live in someone's house uninvited. Well, no, it's not. That's nasty. Who does that? Unless you're a complete nutter ratbag, and that's what we were. So we were living in his house. We'd eaten all of his food. I got absolutely tired. It's all right to eat people's food, but it's another thing to climb into their beds, isn't it? You don't get into beds uninvited. So we were sleeping on the floor. And we'd come in really late at night after being in the centre of the city. I can tell you the street, but I'm not going to. I still remember the name of that street. But we came home late at night, and after 3 nights of this, I said to the guys, I can't do this anymore. I don't want to sleep on the floor. And I'd seen an old mattress out in the garden. So I dragged this mattress in before we left and just left it in the hallway. When we got home that night, the other guys went and lay down on the floor. Well, I had the luxury. And I fell onto the mattress and I was just gone, asleep for a while. And I woke up tearing the skin off my body. That mattress was infested with fleas. You know those little creatures, they can get in everywhere. And once they bite you, just keep scratching till you bleed. I had them all through my hair. I had them in every crack and crevice. I had them behind, they were everywhere. And after scratching and screaming, these guys woke up because I had the lights on them, tearing stuff off me. They only had to look. And then we looked, and there were so many of them, you could go like that and the floor moved. I'm prone to a little bit of hyperbole. But there were a lot of them. A huge number. I went and showered. And they don't come off. They don't leave you, those things. And eventually, particularly when they're in your hair, finally we got them off, and then you can't put your clothes back on, can you? Because they're all through your clothes. So I was shaking my clothes. Anyway, it was a bad time. Not enjoyable. At that moment, home looked okay. Actually, it looked good. And I said to these guys, I don't care what you do, I'm heading back. Now, that was a decision that cost us days because we had come across through Narandra and Hay, but we weren't going back that way. So we decided to go down past what's the place with the big blue lake? Oh, beautiful place. Anyway, we went down through there and we went along the sea coast and the ocean road. It's a long way back to Sydney. And we took 3 days hitching, walking. Eventually I got the flu. The other guys weren't much better. We didn't sleep for days on end. And finally we dragged ourselves into the city of Sydney. It was great to be home. But when you're invincible, I just called my girlfriend and said, hi, it's Barry here. And she said, yes. I said, well, would you like to go out? And she said, I thought you were never coming back. And I said, look, I'm here. Do you want to go out or not? What a catch, girls. I mean, doesn't that send a thrill through you? What was wrong with this girl? She said yes. So I borrowed my dad's truck and I went across the city and picked her up. We went down to the beach. We were at the beach for a long while. And then decided to go home because I was starting to feel a little weary, 3 days without sleep. You know, you can't do it forever. And we were on the way home and I looked down at the fuel gauge on my dad's utility and it was somewhere between fumes and empty. So, you know, I realised I'd never get home. And my father was almost religious in keeping his car topped up. So I don't know why it was like that. I decided I'd pull in and pick up some fuel. I went into the garage and get out and did the thing, and then I started looking for my wallet. You know, and guys, we always carry them, don't we, in the back pocket. Wears out your trousers, but you always got them in the back pocket. Well, it wasn't there. And I went into the car and I started looking under the seats. I just about dismantled the car trying to find my wallet. I had no money, but my dad had given me $10. So that's all I had, and that's all I had put the fuel in. And I thought, you know, I've got to find this thing. In the end, I had to walk in and say to this service station guy, I'm sorry, mate, I've lost my wallet. And his response was this, I have kids like you, it wasn't kids, he said blokes, I think. Blokes like you come in here every night of the week trying to do this sort of thing. stand over there, I'm going to call the police. And I looked at him and I thought, he's a lot smaller than me. I'll just knock his lights out and run and hope the car starts. So I was, you go back and forward and fortunately there are times in your life when stupidity doesn't rule. And I said to this man, would you like to call my father? He will vouch for the fact that he will come and pay. And so this guy called my dad and had a conversation with my father. And just as he was about to put the phone down, I grabbed it from his hand and I said to my dad, Dad, I'd like you to go to sleep. Go to bed and go to sleep. My father didn't sleep. I don't know how he survived while I was gone here in South Australia. Because my father would pray through the night when I wasn't at home. And I'll tell you why I knew that in a minute. But this night I told him, go to bed and go to sleep. So my father, being an obedient person, actually went to bed and went to sleep. And I said, and I can't identify the girl, and if the minute I give her a phony name, I'll use the right one. So you just have to put up with the fact, my girlfriend, all right? I said to her, we need to go back to the beach to find my wallet. And on the way back, this boy prayed, God, I want the wallet, all right? Does God answer those sorts of prayers? Does he? I didn't get the formulas right. There was no in Jesus' name. There was no dear Heavenly Father. There was none of that. God, I want the wallet, all right? I believe God does answer prayers like that. We went back down to the beach. We went to the spot where I knew we had been for most of that time. I ran my hand through the sand, and you know what? Phenomenal luck. I picked it up. I thought, that is incredible. Out of all that beach, I picked up my wallet. Well, I got back in the car and I was sort of like a cat on hot bricks. That's incredible. But there was no thank you. And on the way home, I was starting to realise that sleep deprivation was catching up. And so I simply said to, I'll call her Helen. You can't keep saying my girlfriend. Anyway, I said to Helen, doesn't suit her. I said to Helen, you have to try and keep me awake. I cannot cope. I'm going to go to sleep. And she said, I'm tired too. And I said, look, you don't know what tired is. I've travelled for 3 days. I haven't slept. I was quite vociferous about my protestation that she needed to keep me awake. Well, she tried for about 30 seconds and then she lay down on the seat, put her head on my knee. It was a bench seat. Put her head on my knee and she was gone. And I was so distressed and angry with her. So I turned the radio up really loud. And it was a great period of music. You'll never guess what the song was. It was the Beatles. And they were singing these magic lyrics. She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, they're deep, aren't they? I mean, you don't have songs like that these days. She loves you, and I'm singing at the top of my lungs and realising it's not helping. So I started putting my head out the window and come back in. And you know when you're really tired, you become mesmerised. And I just got caught on the speedo and I'd realise and shake myself awake that I had just driven for how long without seeing the road. So back and forward, singing, cold air, singing. I don't know when it happened, but eventually I heard this bang! And I woke up to find my head jammed between the steering wheel and the side of the car. And I knew that something was wrong. He's a bright boy. I knew that something was wrong because I could see sparks dancing. And I looked out and I began to realise that the lights were not looking straight ahead. The lights were facing each other. And I had run into a pole and the car had married itself to the pole. And I tried to get out and the side door was buckled. I couldn't get the windows I couldn't do anything to get out my side. Didn't realise that my legs were all tangled and wrecked. But I then tried to shake, what did we call her? Oh, yes. I tried to shake Helen, and she didn't wake up. She wouldn't wake up. And I was screaming at her to get out of the car. I knew about fuel and sparks, and I knew that we'd be incinerated any moment. So I kept trying to shake her. In the end, I couldn't get out her door either. So I lay down on top of her and kicked until the window on her side of the ute exploded. And then I climbed out and fell down, and stood up and fell down, and stood up and fell down. It took a while before it sunk in that my leg wasn't holding me. And eventually I balanced on one leg and I reached in and I grabbed her legs and I pulled her out through the window, and we both fell onto the road. She still wasn't nothing. It was starting to become clear to me what I had done. By the time I dragged her away from the wreck and we're over on the other side of the road, people started coming out of their houses. This was Hornsby Heights. Most of you won't know where that is, but it's just before Galston Gorge. The last of the houses, and lights were coming on only one side of the pole, the city side. Everything beyond it was in darkness. I'd wiped out the power supply. And a lady came out, and I'll tell you her name. I want to just pay tribute to this woman. Her name is Mrs. Masters. She now lives in the retirement village at Avondale, and I see her regularly. She came out, and as a nursing sister, she took control. That's a wonderful thing, to have someone who could take control of the situation. And she's told me what to do. She said, you need to put your thumb inside your head. You've got an artery missing there. It's been broken and my ear was hanging off. And she said, and she started checking me, and she said, you need to do something about your knee. You've got a severed artery there as well. So here's your thumb, stick that in the joint and stem the bleeding. So this is gory, isn't it, kids? Good grief. Don't listen anymore. And I'm sitting there holding myself together, but the only thing that I was focused on was the young lady on the ground. I didn't care about anybody in those days. I was selfish, self-centered, a pig of a kid. But I did have some feeling for her. And I realised that there had been nothing. No breathing, no screaming, no crying, nothing. And for the second time that night, I started to pray. My dad's a prayer warrior. I'd heard him pray so many times, but I hadn't allowed him to pray for me for years. And I was trying to dredge up the formulas, you know. Dear God, loving Heavenly Father, anything that would break through to get hold of God so that He would come and fix this mess. And I was praying my heart out. I was trying absolutely everything to get God involved with my mistakes. And it didn't happen. Eventually Mrs. Master asked somebody to go and get a blanket, and they brought the blanket out and they pulled it right up and over her face. And at that stage I knew what I had done. Some of you may have been in situations like that. To know what you are responsible for. And in the darkness, I looked down. I could hear the siren coming. I could see the flashing red light. Why do they need sirens and lights at that time of the morning? It was now somewhere around 2 o'clock. Why wake up everybody? But they came, they pulled up, they picked up Helen, put her into the back. Now, this is a true story, so just because it's a made-up name. They put her in the back of the ambulance, and I thought, well, they won't ask me to sit in there. But they did. These guys put me in the back of the ambulance with this lifeless girl. And I've been praying now for I don't know how long, pleading with God to fix this. And as I sat there in the ambulance, I coughed out my desperate final prayer. Dear God, if you will fix this, I will do anything. Have you prayed those sort of prayers, those bargaining sort of prayers? If you, then I will. And that's what I was into, bargaining with God. I didn't need to twist his arm. I'm trying to. And in the middle of it all, I said to him, God, if you will fix this, I'll do anything. You can have me. I'll even be, what's the worst thing I could think of? I'll even be a pastor. Well, I am. So you know the end of the story. And with that prayer, that lifeless form screamed. It was a beautiful sound. Only girls can do those screams, you know, the ones that make your hair stand up on end. Even blood-matted hair, just... And this time, guys, I said thank you. I said thank you. When we got to the hospital, my dad walked in. And I thought, where on earth did he come from? So my father stepped into the hospital and he started to... I'd been having a bit of a blue with the doctors because in those was a period of the Beatles when we had hair. And so I had long hair. And these guys are starting to cut my hair off and then shave. And you know, it would have been really trendy now. But then to have really long hair on one side and be completely bald on the other just wasn't a good look. And then they cut the leg off my jeans. I mean, that's just sacrilegious. Just right there, took the legs off. So I was telling them how I felt about them. And my father walked in and he said, you know, are they going to be all right? And they said, well, you can see that the young bloke's, you can see what he's doing. And he said, but what about Helen? And they said to her, we don't know. She hasn't regained consciousness. We don't know what the future is for her yet. We need for her to come back before we can do some tests and stuff. And at that stage, my father did a ridiculous thing. He said in a public emergency room, do you mind if I pray? And everything, all the anger came back in me and it just bubbled to the surface. And I was so angry I could have spat on him. I said, what is the matter with you? Why would you do that here? Well, that was all in my head. And he prayed, but something happened inside his son. Something softened as I listened to my dad's prayer. I want to tell you how he got there that night. And I usually forget to tell you this part of the story, but my father did go to sleep. And I used to know that he would not be asleep. When I came home, I used to walk in the door at about 5:30 in the morning, and I'd climb we never locked the doors at our house unless I wasn't home. And when I was out, my dad would lock the doors so that I had to climb up the drain pipe and get into my room. So every time I did that, I'd be really tired. I'd throw myself down on the bed, and my father would have a tennis racket, a cricket bat, pair of boots, something in my bed. And I'd pick them up and throw them down on the floor in a rage, and then I'd hear my father laughing. Then my dad could go to sleep. His son was home. This night he actually went to sleep. Maybe nights and nights of praying I was coming home, he went to sleep. At the very moment I hit the pole, he woke up. He fell out of bed onto his knees and started to pray for his son, who was somewhere out there in the night. He woke my mother, tried to get the lights, and the whole of Galston had gone. We had lost the power supply. Somebody had hit a pole. So my dad went out. The clock on the kitchen stove had stopped. At the same time, he'd noticed that he'd got up. And he woke my mother, got into the family car and said, we need to go and find him. And he drove past his wrecked ute and got to the hospital shortly after we did. Well, you would think that would change a person, wouldn't you? Do you think that experience would bring about some change? It made no difference. When when a heart is hardened, it's really hard for God to break through. And on the Sabbath morning, I finally got out of hospital. I was starting to walk reasonably well, and I had some hair growing back, and I was lying on my back under an old FJ, if only I'd kept the car, under an old FJ, doing some work on Sabbath morning, and my father, the head elder of our church, came and he looked down through, I can still see his face, he looked down through, past the motor and saw me, and he said, "Baz, are you coming to church today?" And I just spat on him. I told him what he could do with his church, and particularly his pastor. And my dad's eyes all welled up with tears, and he walked away weeping because there was no change in his son. And I thought, this is the day, not that the Lord has made, this is the day I'm going to go to church and I will never have to go again. So I went outside, got my leathers on, didn't clean up at all, jumped on the motorbike, and I went to church. And I got there and I popped a few monos in the car park. Just nobody came. I thought the deacon, I'd planned it so I wouldn't have to go into church. And I thought the deacons would come and get rid of me before it went much further. But they didn't come, so I dropped the bike down on its side and did some donuts and spat rocks on the saints' cars. That's a surefire way to get them out. They didn't come. I had to go in and sit in church. And when I went inside, I sat in the back seat, and my dad was up on the platform. And I watched what was happening to him. Publicly, he started to weep. He didn't care what I looked like. He was just overjoyed that his son was in church. And I was angry. I want to know what was wrong with this man. The sermon finished. All I remember about the sermon was it was tedious. It was boring in the extreme. So I don't remember anything about it except that. When it was over, people started walking out, and I didn't get a chance to get out, and people come out and they're on the shoulder and saying, "Why? Good to see you." And I'm thinking, what is wrong with you? What do you mean, good to see me? I've come specially dressed for this occasion. Well, they kept doing that. Eventually I had to get out, and I went and I shook my dad's hand, and he couldn't speak. He just said everything he wanted to say with a handshake. Because in those days, men didn't hug. You notice the change, you older people? Kids hug each other now. In those days, men did not hug. Now I kiss my dad when I see him. But in those days, it was 3 quick handshakes and you let go. There was no hugging. So my dad shook my hand firmly 3 times. Then I shook the pastor's hand and he looked down, and I'd had black grease on my hands, and now he had a black hand which he didn't know what to do with. So how do you get your hanky out of your pocket for your best? And I could see him, it was bubbling, and he wanted to say something, and I'd got to the place where I was just saying, come on. Because as soon as he spoke, then I was going to let rip and tell him what I thought about him and his church. Well, he didn't say anything. Thank God he said nothing. I walked down the steps, but that's when the deacon came. Now, this man had a son at Avondale, training to be a pastor, and a daughter who was marrying a church worker. 2 perfect children. My father had me. I don't even talk about my sisters, but he had... Anyway, this guy started to come up towards me, and I thought, for some reason, I was so sure he was going to hit me, and I thought, I will king hit him first. So as he comes up, I'm shaping up to let fly, and I was going to knock out this, and he was much taller than me, big skinny man, but I think I could have had him. And as I shaped up, he threw out his hand. And did you see what happened? Oh, sorry. You can't help but take an open hand. And he took my hand and he was pumping it up and down, telling me how great it was to see me at church, and I'm thinking, what? I had a heart full of bile, a mouthful of venom. This isn't what I'd planned on. And at that moment, there was a long line of people. at a church that I didn't know had been praying for me for years. And the next person who came to see me, I will never forget him, a little man called Bill Winterton. Tiny little Englishman, came up to about there on me. And he came up and he wrapped me in his arms and he put his head on my shoulder and he cried. And he said, "Barry, welcome home. I have prayed so long for this day." I went to church that day determined to not ever have to go again. And I've never stopped going. And that church now, I've been in ministry nearly 40 years. Well, I have started my 40th year. I know that my home church will still pray for me tomorrow. They do not forget the children of the church. I don't know how much time I've got. And now that it's 8:30, I don't think I've got any. How long are you prepared to stay tonight? Longer. Let me see if this works. Ellen White has some really fascinating things to say about young people, and most of the time we miss them. This is one of them. A church is languishing. What does languishing mean? Not a word we use very often. What does languishing mean? Dying. The church is dying for the help of young men, and I've put the bracketed piece in, and young women who will bear a courageous testimony, who will with their ardent zeal stir up the sluggish energies of God's people and so increase the power of the church in the world. She knew that this church needed and needs its young people, desperately needs them. Preachers or laymen advanced in years, and you're looking at one, cannot have half the influence upon the young that the youth devoted to God can have upon their associates. With such an army of workers as our youth, properly trained, might furnish, how soon the message of a crucified, risen and soon coming Saviour might be carried to the whole world. Was it something I said? Before I get you to look at that, I just want to ask you a question. How many young people have left, I'm assuming you're not all from this church, but from whichever church you come from, percentage-wise, how many young people have left your church in the last 5 years? Have you had 10? Have you got 5 left? 70%. Anybody else? It's not a pleasant thing to talk about, but we need to become aware of it. How many young people have left? If you look at Roger Dudley's study, Roger did a 10-year study. He started with people who were 16 and were determined to stay in the church, and 10 years later, at the midpoint, halfway through, 49% had left church. He couldn't contact them anymore. They were no longer available. When he finally finished the study, he found that about half of the half who said that they were still connected were now coming to church. So we'd lost, in that study, he'd lost about 75% of the young people. 50% in reality, about 25% in total who were still coming to church on a regular basis. The Value Genesis study has shown that 10% are not planning to be in the church when they are 40. In fact, that figure is now higher. So they've already intentionally made a decision that they will sever connection while they're still in their teen years. So they're not planning on being part of the church when they're 40. So if you look at it, a conservative estimate would probably be, 70% seems high, but a conservative estimate would be something like 50%. I know that in the valley, in California that runs from Loma Linda across down through Los Angeles and up to where we've got our media centre. It's not a long drive, probably 120 k's. There are 400,000 ex-Adventists. 400,000. And most of them have not severed connection because they've stopped believing. I've got a cousin who's my age who hasn't been to church since he was 16, who will give me, anytime I want it, a really well-structured Bible study on the second coming, and reminds me quite regularly we're near the end of time. But he doesn't come to church. He wants nothing to do with church. Strange. So we are hemorrhaging at an alarming rate. I want you to tell me what are some of the reasons why people sever connection, young people in particular. Why do they move away from church? Have you ever asked? Okay, so hypocrisy becomes one of them. I'd like those who aren't hypocrites to put up their hands. Okay, we've got one person in the church. Two. If I said, there's a wonderful story about a little guy in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. You know, he's only a kid, and he's walking across between the Catholic and the Protestant territory, and he gets stopped by a gang of kids, and they say, "Are you Protestant or Catholic?" And he knew if he made the wrong decision, he could end up with the beating of his life. So he said, "Well, I'm actually a hypocrite." And they weren't sure what that was. So they let him go. My contention is that it's very difficult to find people who aren't hypocrites. Not all of us live up to exactly what we say we believe. Okay, so hypocrisy, no involvement in the church. What other? Boring is a word you hear an awful lot, isn't it? And I wonder how, when I was at Andrews, I was watching kids in the early stages of texting, and they were sitting there, and I watched these kids texting, and they were actually texting the kid on the other side of the table, and I couldn't help myself. I went over and I said, "Why don't you just talk to each other?" And they said, "It's nowhere near as much fun." I thought, how is that fun? Well, boredom. When you're bored, you will do anything. My son-in-law is a youth pastor, and I felt the need to give him a little bit of a talking to, because he was on the platform one Sabbath when I was at Hinsdale, and I could see he was texting. At first I thought he was looking for the Bible on his phone, and then I realised he couldn't be with the speed his fingers were going. So after church I said to him, "Kenny, what are you doing? You know, church isn't the time to be texting." And he said, "Well, if you were sitting where I was and you could see the 50 kids in the balcony who were not connected with church at all, I was sending them text messages to keep them involved with what was happening." And I said, "Thank God for you." So some other reasons. We've got hypocrisy, we've got boring, we've got not involved. What are some of the other reasons? Okay, so they make friendships outside of the church. I was the youth director for England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. And in Ireland, I remember going to Ireland, and there were 12 young people in the church. Not one church, I'm talking about the Irish Adventist church, 12 young people. And one of the young guys said to me, "Pastor, what am I supposed to do?" He said, "I've been out with every girl from 12 to 20. I don't like any of them." I thought, good grief, what do you mean 12 to 20? And he said, "I went out with a Catholic girl and her brothers came round to see me. Said if I wanted to keep walking, I wouldn't come back." So he said, I'm really at a loss to know what to do. And I spoke to his pastor about bringing him to a youth congress. And the population in Ireland really changed, because there were a whole stack of young people. All of the Irish youth came to the youth congress, and all of them came home with partners, girlfriends, boyfriends. It's a wonderful thing. Some other reasons. Christians are nasty. Yeah, that's true. Okay, if you've got everything, you don't need God. And that's probably true of most of the Western world.
Sometimes I see a similarity between the church program and what's available out in the world.
A similarity.
Yeah. For example, the music that you might attend at a church can be perceived to be the same as out in other places that we could name.
Okay. I haven't heard that from young people, but I'm not going to say that it's wrong because I don't know. I'll give you a list, and these were developed back in 1970 when most of the young people in this room weren't even gleams in their parents' eyes, right? If you look at these, this goes back now 40 years. Church membership without personal conversion was the first big one. I got baptised, but I didn't know why. And in the end, it didn't make sense, so I walked away. Impersonal, uncaring attitude on the part of older members. The older people in the church didn't seem to care about me. Phony appearing lives of adult members. That's the hypocrisy one. No sense of relevance to needs. It did nothing. Religion didn't make a difference in my own life, and I didn't want to be a hypocrite. So rather than be a hypocrite like the hypocrites who go to church, I decided I'd get out of it and not be that way. Absence of thinking for oneself. And I'll just go through these. That was 1973. If you look at it, a misplaced emphasis on non-essentials being too important. And I'll give you one example of that. I took this, I've been running this seminar for many years in the Adventist church and other churches besides Adventist churches, because this is a problem that's not just ours. One young lady came to me and she said, Pastor, my brother loves the Lord, but he hasn't been to church for the last 2 years. And I know better. My training tells me you don't ask why, you listen. And I just couldn't help myself. I said, why? And she said to me, well, he was asked to be a deacon in the church. I know it's a big ask. And he came to the back of the church on his big day. He was holding the offering bag. He was standing beside the other deacon. This was his big moment. And the elder stood up and said to him, son, there's a problem immediately when somebody does it to you. Son, if you're going to take up the offering in this church, you need to wear a tie. And the boy didn't know what to do. He was now embarrassed, so he turned on his heel and he passed the offering bag to the other deacon and he walked out, and he hadn't been to church for 2 years. Now, if it had been me, you know a little bit about me now, I would have walked down to the nearest person with a tie and asked to borrow it. And then tied it around my head and said, now let's do this thing. We put a huge amount of emphasis on things that aren't essential and are not important. The tie thing is gone for the most part, I've noticed. I go to college church, and I'm one of the few people in the church who wears a tie. So I know how old I am now. But it's a really strange thing. A lot of young people don't even have ties, so this is a non-issue now. Academy or church school disciplinary methods are too harsh. Preoccupation with organisation on the part of leaders, and the quality of sermons. Now, I want to show you, we did the same, we asked the same questions again 20 years later in the 90s with the First Value Genesis study, and I want you to see how things have changed. Not. Adult members live phony lives. Church places too much emphasis on non-essentials. Attitudes of older members are critical and uncaring. Now, this is perception. It may not be reality. I thought my church was critical and uncaring, but I walked in the door and I found it was exactly the opposite of that. But my perception was, for me, the reality. Attitudes of older members are critical and uncaring. Church leaders are preoccupied with organisation and not concerned with people. Worship services are dull and meaningless. I want to give you some good news. If you do come tomorrow afternoon, if I haven't frightened you off, I'm going to give you the latest round of Value Genesis results. And one of the things that young people are telling us now is that their faith is growing because of the church worship service as much as any other factor. We have done something that has paid some dividends. The way we are doing worship now finds an answering chord in the lives of kids. Didn't want to be a hypocrite. The church is too restrictive. Attracted to a different lifestyle, one of the ones we had mentioned here. Do not have any real friends at church. And the church does not allow me to think for myself. So we haven't changed that much. As I looked at the results again, we didn't ask this series of questions of the teenagers, but my hunch is that this has changed quite considerably now. And I'll share some of those results tomorrow afternoon. When we look at it, there's a series of problems here. There's a series of control, a lack of caring, a lack of meaning and purpose, personal integrity, and the whole area of discipline and family problems, all of that. They're the 5 main factors as to why kids sever connection with their church. After Roger Dudley's 10-year study, he came to 4 basic reasons for this severing of connection: alienation, irrelevance, intolerance, and inconvenience. They were the 4 big reasons that he found for young people severing connection. And I'm going to share the results of this tomorrow as well, because this is really interesting. But if you want to see where kids do remain in church, the church has to challenge their thinking. The kids need to be able to ask questions. They want a church that is open to new ideas. If you look at those results there, you can see how at the age of 12 they have one perception. By the time they get to 18, it has changed. Doesn't matter whether it's South Pacific or North America. It's the same sort of stuff. If kids are going to stay in the church, it has to be an open church that allows them to ask questions where their thinking is challenged. It has to feel warm. It must feel friendly. I'm going to show you some stunning results for some of these things tomorrow as to how kids perceive the church now and why those perceptions actually change. I want to do this really quite quickly because of our time. No young person leaves the church without a cry for help. Think back to the young people that you know who've left the church. Those cries for help may not be literal tears, but they will have made some sort of statement about the church and why they are going. And often that cry goes unheeded. If we look at perceptions of church, I'm going to deal with this a lot more tomorrow, so I will leave that for now and not take you through those. The church invariably screens out those cries. So the kid's crying out for help and the church screens it out. Let me give you an example. I was in one of our island nations and the church had lost all of its young people. I mean, I'm seriously telling you, all of its young people. There were none left. It was just older people in the church. And the elder came to me and he said, I don't know what's the matter with these kids. They just want to social all the time. And I said, yeah, they do. And what are you doing for that? And his response to me was, well, at least once a quarter we have a social event in our church. And you wonder why they're going down the road to the Mormon church to play basketball every day? You do something once a quarter? This is the time in kids' lives when they want to connect and be together. And if the church does nothing to facilitate that, the church needs to rethink where it's at. youth, you know, if they get that cry screened out, then the next thing is that the kids skip church. And when you skip church, you always get seen. Seriously, don't you? If you're going to do the wrong thing, guys, you will be seen. Somebody will see you. And they will tell everybody else what they saw you down the pub. So they will let people know. I didn't. No. But what happens, that invariably happens. And people jump to the wrong conclusions, don't they? So quickly. I'll tell you just a simple story. My car broke down. I mean, really broke down. It was bad. $1,800 worth bad. Anyway, I'm broken down on the side of the road. The next morning, I am sitting in the... This was a one-horse... No, they didn't even have a horse. They had a pub and a garage. And there was nowhere to sit while my... This was Sabbath morning. Nowhere to sit while my car was in the garage getting an assessment. And I'm sitting outside the pub. Sabbath morning. I was the division youth director. My face was quite widely known. On Monday morning, my boss at the division office called me in to ask me why I was sitting outside a pub on Sabbath morning and not in church. And I told him, my car broke down. How come they can call you to tell you that I'm outside the pub but not even stop to ask if I needed help? If you do the wrong thing, somebody sees you. Every time. So you skip church, you do the wrong thing, and then the church feels pain. And then the church decides they need to punish or shut the young person out. And I hate that little stick man thing there. And you can see why, can't you? Look at this profile. The size of a small nation. The church punishes the kid and shuts them out. Now, this doesn't happen as much today as it once did, and I thank God for that. I had a lady come to me and she said, Pastor, you need to call the church board. And I said, okay. Why? And she said, well, Cheryl. And I said, yes, Cheryl. I knew what she was on about. You need to call the church board and you have to punish her. What are you going to do? And I said, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to knit a little pair of booties or a matinee jacket or something? Because this young girl is about to face the greatest crisis of her life. She is going to be an unwed mother. Painful, painful, painful. What are you going to do? And she kept pushing and she said to me, but you don't understand. We disfellowship girls who do this. And I said, that's true, there are some churches who do. But I will call the church board and I will discipline your son. And she walked away because she didn't realise that I knew that he had planted the seed. We've got double standards on some of these things. So punishing, and incidentally, I didn't. I got the church to rally around Cheryl and see her through an incredible crisis, and she stayed with the church, and eventually I married the two of them and I dedicated the twins. And at the end of the day, that mother came back to me and thanked me for not taking a punitive, harsh position with her now daughter-in-law. The youth then becomes hurt and angry. I think that little guy describes it fairly well. And then the young person will go into denial where they'll say, oh, look, I don't care anyway. Why should I belong to that group of people? You know, what's the point of that? When you hear those sorts of statements, in fact, they are making a statement of exactly the opposite sort. They do care. They do want to belong. They are feeling hurt. Recognise it and take You can cut this off, incidentally, at any one of these stages. You can just cut it off after the cry for help. I wish we had a basketball court like the Mormons. There's a huge cry for help. Well, let's do something about it. If only, as soon as you hear that, if only we, I wish we could. All of those are cries for help, which go unheeded so often. Ultimately, if we do nothing about it, denial is the last step before, I won't say apostasy, I'll say withdrawal. I want to give you some strategies for doing something about this. Church. There's many strategies. Tomorrow afternoon we'll talk about family strategies. But tonight I want to talk to you as a church family, as a body of people who deeply care about young people. You will need to construct a list of the missing youth. Some of you have done this workshop with me before. But if you don't have that list, you will never know who's missing. Get serious about it. And if you're the youth leader of your church, come ask for a time with the church board. Work with your pastor and ask for time with the church board and alert the church to the names of those who no longer attend. And people will be shocked at how many have walked away. So construct the list. I went to that my church, little church, where that last story came from. When I got there, there were 6 kids in the church. I'd just left the biggest church in the conference with 400 young people to go to a little country church where there were 6 kids. And I was involved in youth ministry and suddenly realised that I wasn't. There weren't any kids there. And I said to the elder, "Where are the kids?" And he said, "That here, look, there's 6 of them up the back there." Well, you know the reason he didn't know that they were missing? Because his 2 kids were still coming to church. And I said to him, "You've either got a lot of barren women or infertile men. Because in a church this size, you don't have 6 kids." Must have been very good TV shows. I don't know what's wrong here. I didn't say that, but that was going through my head. And as I thought about it, I decided that I would start to do the homework, and I started tracking kids in that church. And I was right. There were 2 families alone who had 18 children. Just 2 families, and I had 6. 18 of them. It was very hard to find them. But there are always switchboards in a church. Do you know that? Grandma Bramble knew every kid in that church, and I finally found Grandma Bramble. I went to her place and she said, "Pastor, what's on your heart?" And I said, "You are. Let me pray with you." And she said, No, something's on your heart. And I said, "Well, Grandma, I have been here for 6 months and I've been chasing kids. I've been trying to find the kids of this church, and I go to their homes. I can never find them at home. I'll tell you where other places I went to try and find them." But eventually this lady said to me, I love this lady from Guyana, a little black lady, and she was just a powerhouse. She said, "Who would you like to talk to, son?" I knew how old I was at that stage. And I mentioned a boy's name, and she sent one of her grandchildren running, and within minutes that boy was standing in the lounge room with his hands behind his back and his head down saying, "You called for me, Grandma?" She was the matriarch who knew every kid. What a gold mine to find her. After that I found kids, but I went into into pubs. This was the church pastor. I said to my congregation, after the prayer meeting, I'm going to dedicate 2 hours to looking for kids. I want you in the church praying for me because I'm going to be in the worst part of this town. And as I left, I went to a pool room one night, and it was just, you know what those places are like, where it's totally dark and you just got the light over the tables. I walked in, I saw a group of boys, and I walked over and I said, look, I'm looking for some young guys. They said, yeah. I said, well, do you know Merrison? And these guys looked at me. I said, I'm serious, do you? And I noticed, as I'm talking, one of the guys sort of slopes to the back and slopes off into the darkness. And then the next one, and I made another name. And then this guy was there, and I said, do you know? And he started to move, so I grabbed him. And he said, who wants to know? And I said, I do. And he said, who are you? And I said, I'm your pastor. And he said, what are you doing in here, pastor? And I said, I'm here because you're here. And I don't find you at church, but I do find you here. So I'm going to keep coming back here, and I'm going to embarrass the life out of you by coming in here as the pastor while ever you come in here. I finally found a list. I had 40 kids in that church that had walked away. The church clerk's records are going to help you. They'll have the names of only the baptised youth who've left. And there's lots of kids postponed baptism, and I'll tell you about that tomorrow. Do you realise that 20 years ago when we did the first Value Genesis study in Australia, 81% of our young people were baptised by the end of high school. You know what the figure is now? It's 38%. It's flip-flopped. So Sabbath school record cards are going to help you with names to chase those. Who's the best source, guys? Who's the best source for who has left the church? You. Because you know them. You remember them. So you become the best source for who has left church. If we look at this, you're going to have to alert the church elders, the church board, that you're going to really get serious about chasing young people, about seeking them and trying to bring them back. Now, if you don't address the problems that they left over, then it's going to be difficult to attract them back. So all those things we talked about, they need to be addressed. Sell the reclamation concept to your youth team. I hope you've got a youth team. Let them know how many young people have already left. Brainstorm to recall all the other names that you may have missed. Now, I want to tell you something. I went to probably the biggest church in London, Holloway Church, and they asked me to run a youth mission, which I was happy to do. And I said to the young people who were running this thing, I will only do this on one condition, that you find the names of all the kids who've left the church. And they said, Pastor, kids don't leave this church. And I said, just humour me. I'm an Australian. I might be a bit slow. Just humour me a bit. And I said, this coming week, I want you to talk to each other and I want you to talk to everybody. They came back with over 400 names of young people, out of sight, out of mind. They're just been replaced by other ones. 400 of them. They had as many gone as they still had left. The third step in this strategy is this. The youth group leadership team needs to get serious about praying for young people who've left. I want to ask you, all of you in this church tonight, how long has it been since you seriously prayed about young people who have left your congregations? How long has it been since you got really serious about it? Can you recall the faces? Can you see, if they're your children, you know them, don't you? But do you know about other people's? I had one lady at one seminar who said she got really intentional. She went home and she typed out a list and she stuck it on a fridge door so that every time she opened the fridge door, she prayed for the young people who weren't at church. That's intentional. Every single time. When I'm at home, I just like to open the fridge door. I don't have to have anything else. I just like to open the door. Don't you guys? It's nice to see what's in there. It doesn't change in 10 minutes, but still come back. She got really intentional. Then she said to the pastor, during the church, between Sabbath school and church, would it be possible for us to use one of these projectors and run the names down? She said, we don't have to even talk about it. Just run the names down. And these names were coming down the wall. And every week more were added to it. And in the end it was on a scroll. And people would sit in the church and sob. I mean, that's heartbreaking. But you've got to do something about it. And so this became part of the life of that church. And people would say to her, I understand you're praying for people. Could you put my son on your list? I just to know that somebody else is praying for my kids would be a wonderful thing. The fridge door wasn't long enough. That became a really important thing to do. I ran a seminar in North America and there was a... Good grief. Sorry. Now this is too important. Oh, I'm not going to apologise. You can sleep some other time. This youth director, Gwen Baber, her name is, she did this and she thought on the way home, I don't have a local church anymore. I'm the youth director. Who can I pray for? And she started to make a list of the kids she knew had severed connection. She only had 2 people on the list. And she prayed for them that night. She prayed for them the next morning. She got stuck in Minneapolis, St. Paul in a snowstorm on the way back to Canada. And she's there and she thought about this and she thought, those 2, I'm going to pray for those 2 kids. And she said, dear God, you know where they are. I may never see them again, but I want to lift them up to you now. Wherever they are, send your Spirit into their lives. Convict them. So she's praying. And she looked up from her prayer and who's walking across the airport straight towards her is the young boy she's just been praying for. And as he walked across, she just obviously was in a state of shock. And he recognised her, came over, and she said, you'll never guess what I've been doing. She said, and he said to her, Gwen, you've been praying for me, haven't you? I'm not that far away, so don't stop. You don't know the openings God will give you. So you need to construct a strategy for contacting them. Most of them don't leave because they stop believing. So remember that. Personal contact's the best. And I know we live in an age of texting and emails and all the rest of that stuff. But person to person is the strongest thing you can do. When you go up to a friend that's no longer coming to church and say, hey, we miss you. It's much more powerful than sending a text that says, missed you at church this week. Invite them to something neutral, some sort of fellowship activity, relationship-based. Ensure that their friends at church make contact as well. I'll leave this with Nigel, but if you wish to, this is the sort of little form that I used so that I knew exactly what happened with every time I found these kids and visited them. Make the list. I had one girl who made the list. She came to me and said, Pastor, I've got a friend who was at church who doesn't come anymore, and I've been praying for him ever since you've been pastor here. Do you think you could come and talk to him? And I went to see Mike, and this guy just filled the air with, I'd heard most swear words, but I hadn't been on the receiving end of them. And he just told me where I could put myself. It was really nasty, and I went back to Anne and I said, look, I'm sorry, Anne, but he didn't like me. And she said, can you try again? And I said, I am not a masochist. You know, I don't want to put myself in that situation. I mean, someday it might be an opening, but at the moment there's no point in me going to see him because he doesn't like me. Well, she made me go back again. The next time it was worse. The third time I said to her, look, I don't think this is working. I mean, I'll go and talk to anybody, but this this isn't working. She said, look, just try one. He wants to learn to play squash, and I understand you can play. So I went up to this young bloke and I said, you know, I understand you'd like to learn to play squash. And he said, I will whip you. I'm going to leave you like a puddle in the corner. And I thought, this is going to be great. I can hardly wait. So I want to tell you, this was one of those prayers. I said, God, give me the strength to give this kid a good hiding. And I left him a puddle in the corner. And as I pulled him out of the corner, I said, would you like to learn to play? He said, it seems you can play a bit. That began a Monday morning together. Today he's a youth pastor in the Adventist church because he had a friend who consistently prayed for him and reached out to him. Thank God for Anne. Pray for them. Visit, make it really short. You don't ever get defensive and you don't tell them that they're wrong. When people tell you how bad the church is, say, yeah, I'm part of it, remember? I know what I'm like. Don't get defensive. Invite them to something fairly neutral, and when they come, involve them. Get them involved as quickly as possible. Not to use is to abuse, and finally to lose. So get them involved as quickly as you can when they do start coming back. And I'll just leave these with you because we're truly out of time. Learn their names. It's really crucial. Learn their names. And that's really important for older people in the church. Affirm what they do well. When they're here, affirm them. I had a girl that came to us. I was the elder of the church at Kellyville. And she came and she said, I think God is asking me to lead in worship. And I said under my breath, I think he's made a mistake. Of course, I'd heard her sing. She couldn't. But who am I to argue with God's call? That girl leads worship for the conference now. She's got a magnificent voice. I do know where it came from, because it wasn't a natural gift that she had. But I got to the place where it wasn't hard to affirm her gift. I should have been doing it before that. Let them know that they have value. Occupy their time. Spend time with someone who has high values. And I'll show you tomorrow the importance of older people mentoring young people. So mentoring, rehearsal skills, what are they going to say the next time? The communication. So this is closing the back door for young people who are currently with us. Do you mind if I pray for you? And we'll close our meeting together. Father God, it's incredible that you, the God of the universe, allow us to reach out to you as a dad. You see us as your children. You care about each of us as if we were a child. Father, we thank you for the love that takes us, that controls us, that guides us. Tonight we just praise you and thank you for Jesus. Lord, we come to you tonight with concerns. Some of us have heavy hearts. Some of us have lost young friends who no longer attend. Father, give us the will to continue to pray for them. Give us the words to say, the attitudes. Help us touch lives. We realise that time is short, that decisions need to be made. And so, Father, we just plead that your Spirit will go before us, give us the right words and attitudes. We ask knowing that you hear and thanking you in advance for answering. In Jesus' name, amen.